Welcome to the Plant Spirit Podcast on connecting with plant consciousness and the healing wisdom of nature. I'm your host, Sara Artemisia, and I'm honored to introduce our next guest to the show today. As the daughter of Kiskeyan immigrants, Elsie Lopez grew up living and traveling through the concrete jungle of New York City and the lush campos of Kiskeya, the Dominican Republic. Elsie is an artist, writer, educator, intuitive designer, herbalist and plant medium, and founder of Gold Water Alchemy and the Gold Water Education Center. She's also the creator of herboscopes and floroscopes, through which she shares knowledge of plant spirit wisdom and medicine. And her work focuses on language, word, and sound medicine, and creating holistic spaces, remedies, and happenings. So Elsie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Your work in the world is so powerful, and I'm really excited for our conversation today. And one of the things I've been feeling into a lot recently is how we can really tune the dial of awareness into a space of presence, and how connecting with nature can really support in this process of connecting to wholeness, releasing grief, connecting to a state of presence. And with everything going on in the world right now, I'm curious to hear a bit about how, in your experience, does listening to the language of the land really help us heal grief and connect to a state of presence?
I think that part of the aspect of listening to the language of the land has a lot to do with the fact that when we tune in, we're able to both hear the call to action while simultaneously hearing the call to rest. And I think that's particularly important for the moment that we find ourselves in. You know, for the past 2 years, I feel like a lot of what we've been called to is to slow down and really pay attention to what's occurring in the world, really pay attention to what's occurring within our communities, really pay attention to what's occurring within our bodies, and simultaneously paying attention to what's occurring in our environment. I feel like people are naturally becoming more aware and cognizant of just like what's happening in their immediate environment. And even with some of the things that feel kind of difficult to contend with, like losses that we've recently experienced or that are spoken to in the news, for instance, I feel like it makes us more attentive, whether that's by a certain kind of design, artificial intelligence, natural intelligence design, maybe a combination of both things. But that design is essentially kind of motivating us to be more attentive, you know, to be more alert. I feel like it's waking people up from a slumber. And I feel like that's part of the language of this land at this moment, is one of awakening, you know, and it's happening in so many different ways. For some people, it's a little bit more difficult still to really contend with what this moment is calling us to. But I think, again, when we tune into the language of the land, we are simultaneously called to action and rest, because I feel like that call to awareness, awakening, more alertness is essentially calling us to slow down so that we're aware enough. And then the act of engaging our awareness is, again, an action. So that's the call to action. You know, there's layers to this, to the process of being aware and consciousness and things like that. And I think that's part of the elevation and consciousness that a lot of people are even speaking to at this time. You know, a lot of people are speaking to like this elevation and consciousness happening. That happens through a grounding process. You know, I think people perceive consciousness as all up here in the head, but I feel like the actual consciousness, the actual awareness, particularly when we're talking about dealing within the plane that we're in, which is a dense material realm, it calls us to a level of grounding. So, you know, I think the land is loud, and I feel like the loudness has a lot to do with also a certain urgency or an emergency. And again, emergency alludes to a movement, a uprising, and something being lifted or some kind of action being called for. Emergent, to come through, to come forth, to become. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. What you just talked about with the grounding piece being so essential. I really feel that so deeply. And I'm curious for folks who maybe haven't experienced or had an experience of connecting directly with the land or with land consciousness. Are there any simple practices that you could share for people who are interested in learning how to communicate with certain types of landscapes or with the land around them?
Yes. Some things that I could recommend, like directly to just about anybody, is just becoming aware of the actual landscape of the place that you find yourself in, becoming aware of not just the plant life that's present or the animals or the insects. That's definitely a big part of it, but the actual landscape, the architecture where you find yourself, what that architecture says about the intention of the design that's present in the landscape where you find yourself, how the design that's present in the landscape where you find yourself may impact your emotions or your thoughts in certain ways. So, those are things that are very simple in the sense that you don't need anything, you don't need anything outside of yourself to start to have these processes internally, to begin to have, again, that awareness about things. So that's something that you can do just by observation of your surroundings. Another thing, that I like to recommend is going either to local gardens or nurseries or spaces where they may have plants that are native to the land where you find yourself. If you have access to that, some people don't have access to that. So, connecting to the land could be a little different for them. But for people who do have access to that, going to places where you can connect with the native flora of a space, also the fauna of the space. So gardens are really good because they'll feature, sometimes, not always, but feature native butterflies or native bees or native plants and flowers and fruits and things like that. And I know, for instance, where I live in Florida is replete with that kind of thing. We have a lot of, it's called Florida. In Spanish, the word Florida means flowering or full of flowers, essentially. So this is literally the flowering state and how it was named because it's so green and lush here. But for places like the concrete jungle where I grew up in, for instance, in New York City, what I was saying earlier is a really good exercise, just becoming aware of the architecture of the space, becoming aware of how even plants are placed. Something that I became aware of when I was living in New York, for instance, is like the amount of space between trees in the city. And it made, like, when I gained a certain awareness about plants and how they operate in their root systems and the wood wide web, for instance, it made me think about New York City and how in certain places, like in where I grew up in the hood, there's so much space between trees. It's like one tree here, one tree on the other end of the street kind of thing. And it's like, I know that plants need community just like we do. So those designs within those spaces say a lot to what those environments do to us on another level, on more subtle levels. And I think raising that awareness, again, is something about, I think the part of the language that the land is holding right now is a healing language. I feel like there was a time when the language of the land was more so a language of creation, where people were like, there were these renaissances or these moments where like the arts were, and right now I feel like the healing, these are still arts, but it's like another level of art or another level of creation where it's more like healing processes that the land is kind of thinking about and causing us to simultaneously think about when we engage with the land. So those are some of the simple things in terms of becoming cognizant of the environment, going to different places. And if you're somebody who likes to write or journal, just journaling about the experiences that you're having, free writing, if that feels comfortable for you, and seeing what kinds of thoughts come through you when you're in certain spaces, because I feel like you're also going to be picking up on the frequency of that space. And whenever you write in a particular space, you also are channeling a certain energy that's present within that space. At least for me, and that's something that's big for me as a writer. I like to move around to different places and see what kinds of things, what kinds of thought processes, what kinds of topics, concepts come to me within those spaces. And, I feel like that's information about that space, not just, I'm in a co-creative process with the land, essentially.
Yeah, I love that. The process that you're describing with writing it feels to me like the way that I experience an environmental flower essence, where creating a flower essence, it is picking up on the vibrational frequencies of the space. And I hear you doing that through your writing, which is super cool. And I know that you work a lot with accessing and communicating healing codes through your writing. And I was curious if you'd be open to sharing a poem or two or an excerpt of something that you've written recently.
Absolutely. Yes, I would love to share something. So a lot of my writing is connected to divination or processes of the mind that are more intuitive or just in a stream, not too much. I don't try to structure my writing too much, but I do use different tools and things like that to prompt processes of writing. So for instance, oracles and cards and things like that, these kinds of systems, plants themselves are often implicated in my writing process. So something that I wrote recently, well, it was a couple months ago, earlier this year in the winter. So it was there's some winter stuff in here too, but I was working with Yarrow flower essence for a poetry workshop that my friend Chanel led. And part of the prompt was to write about boundaries, because Yarrow flower essence is often implicated in boundary work and that kind of stuff. So when I saw that prompt, something that came to me was the word limitations. And now I know that boundaries and limitations are not necessarily always implied one within the other. Boundaries don't always imply limits, and limits don't always imply boundaries, though it's more likely for limits to imply boundaries than boundaries to imply limits. Okay, I'm not going to go into this whole philosophical train of thought, but I just started thinking about styles of poetry that have this idea of a boundary or some kind of limit. And so I wrote a series of haiku, because haiku are there's these short poems. Initially, when they started off, they were written as the introduction to longer poems in Japan, but also in other parts where there's evidence that this was being practiced also in parts of North Africa, for instance. So haiku are 5 syllables, 7 syllables, 5 syllables, or that's how it's taught. It's actually more of a musical energy. So 575 is what's used for the translation in English, but it's not syllables, it's mora, which is based more on a rhythm. So haiku are actually meant to have this musical rhythm to them, essentially. Anyways, I wrote these haiku. It ended up being 6 haiku. I had pulled some cards after I asked certain questions about boundaries. And this is what came forth for me as I was working with Yarrow and boundaries. So the title of this 6 haiku piece, the haiku are meant to all go together, is a process in boundary setting or a movement through seasons. 1, the oracle says, listen to your inner child during the season I was born. 2, be mindful of gestures void of warmth, lacking life, love. The sun taught you better. 3, if in the morning the birds don't sing, stay in bed. There will be less to dread. 4, on life and death. Spring, time's rebirth, when the vultures are active. An intersection. 5, the cardinal asks, what do you remember as I walk through fog? 6, soul retrieval. I call in the me once lost. The sun shines again. So that was that series of haiku. And yeah, it's really interesting too, because the visual aspect, so how it appears on the page, is also a kind of factor in being able to really get the full essence of the piece, which is often a case in my writing. And I'm noticing that because I'm also a very visual person. So when I write, a lot of how I structure things on the page are also meant to be witnessed, if that makes sense. So a lot of my writing is meant to be read by the reader as opposed to by the writer. But yeah, so that was that piece. As I mentioned, I wrote it during the winter. I was born during the winter. So, you know, a lot of things about my inner child were coming up for me during the winter. So that first piece spoke a lot to that. And also because I got a page during my pull. So it was really just like, literally the oracle was saying, listen to your inner child during the season I was born. And that was my first piece. And then it just kind of progressed from there into just what felt like a movement through seasons, because as I was writing each piece, and then afterwards when I read it, I realized how there were literally different seasons implied in what was written. So yeah, that's that.
It's so fascinating to me that writing was connected with Yarrow. And I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience of writing in collaboration with the plants, this co-creative writing process. What is that like for you?
So this is where the term plant medium comes in for me, because I really feel like I become like a channel for them, you know, and I'm speaking this language. And I get this sense that, like my ancestors, which are in the earth now and fertilize the soil for new life, I get a sense that plants understand a lot of languages, because I communicate with my ancestors in more than one language, literally, and then like figuratively. All of these different mediums through which I express myself are a variety of language and are a form of me communicating with my ancestors. So I feel like there's a conversation essentially happening when I am working with plants and doing anything, whether it's writing, which is one of the things I do, whether it's making plant medicine itself, whether it's dancing. You know, I often work with plants as I'm doing a lot of things. So, you know, definitely with the writing, I feel like there's an active communication going on. And that's where that language of the land thing comes in, because there is a sentience connected to it. And through that sentience that doesn't necessarily involve a spoken or a written or read language, I'm able to translate what I'm receiving into words and whatever kind of other thing. So yeah, it's like a translation process essentially, which happens naturally in my mind a lot because I speak multiple languages. And, you know, like when I think about words, I always translate it to see if I can find different roots in the different translations and see how those roots connect. I'm big on etymology and stuff like that. So, you know, I'm always in this like translation process in my mind. So it naturally, it comes to me very naturally, this whole thing with translating plants, communications, and Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, it's fun. Like, I definitely enjoy it.
Yeah, you feel like such a translator of these multiple realms of mediums to me. I love that you brought that up. And also that you just brought up this piece around this connection with your ancestors, how this is connected with the land. And I'm curious, in your experience, why is it so important to connect with the land of our own genetics?
Yeah. So, as I've often brought up and mentioned in conversations, especially leading up to this conversation, there's codes, we receive information through everything that we experience. And every place that we go to, whether we're aware of it or not, we are receiving information consciously or subconsciously. And I know for me personally, whenever I go to the Dominican Republic, which is one of the many lands that my ancestors come from and that my more immediate ancestors come from, I should say, I always experience like these transformations in my life. And I don't know if that's just because of how I'm particularly wired to just like use these moments as transformative. Like I kind of just program myself to transform, essentially, if that makes sense. But I do feel like for a lot of us, it would be the case that when we connect to our ancestral lands, we receive kind of like an activation of codes within us that are already within us that contain a certain story or a certain history. And with activating those codes, we are able to, again, it all goes back to like, because of what we've experienced in our trajectory as humanity, there's been this compounding of things to address and heal. As time has progressed, I feel like less and less of our ancestors were concerned about, just maintaining a certain equilibrium within the timeline, and became more concerned with like basic survival and things like that. And that became more, and especially as capitalism became more of a thing in our society. So I know that a lot of our generation, for instance, and the generation right before us and the generations and some of the generations after us are tasked with a certain kind of confronting of the timelines that we've been operating within. And so going into these ancestral spaces will give us access to those timelines on another level. We can hear the stories from our people. We can do research on the internet or in books about the history of those lands. But I feel like there's something else that happens when we physically ground ourselves and make that connection with the earth physically, when our feet touch that particular land, when our body is exposed to the air in that particular land, certain things are awakened. There's a new thing happening. So naturally, there's updates that occur in our system. So I think it's important for that reason, just so that we can really, I think it brings us closer to the awareness of our true purpose, or even of things that we experience. For instance, for me personally, being connected to those lands and knowing the stories and things like that has made me aware of a lot of the reasons why certain things have happened in my life. Furthermore, understanding my parents more, understanding why they had certain experiences and why things were certain ways, and why I've inherited some of the traumas that I've inherited, along with all the gifts that I've inherited, which I definitely exalt those things, but also being mindful and cognizant of the fact that there's been trauma. So yes, it's all part of, I think it connects us to that knowledge of, again, timelines, time spirals, and how to begin to create new ones that are more healthy and balanced and harmonious and things like that, because it's that time. It's just that time in the story. It's just that time, if I was to say, what's the message? That's the message. It's that time. You know what I'm saying? So that's just part of the experience.
Yeah. Thanks so much for sharing that. That has totally just shed some light on an experience I had a few years ago where I was driving to work. I had a long commute at that point and was feeling really called to go to the land where my ancestors are from, particularly in the Carpathian mountain range in the southeast part of Poland that's really close to Ukraine. And I was feeling really called to do this, and this feeling of wanting to physically walk where my DNA has walked before, specifically in natural spaces. Like, and that part of the world is very natural. There's a lot of big wild animals that still live there. It's really wild space. And I was feeling that and thinking that, daydreaming into that. And then all of a sudden I felt and heard this really loud message that like took up the entire space in the entire car. And it said, and when you do this, an ancestral healing will happen. It was so big. And it was this feeling of, it's not even going to be on the mental level. Like I might not even be cognizant of what is happening at that time, but there was this sense of physically being in the place, physically walking in the natural spaces where my DNA has been before, that there's a call to that. I haven't yet been able to do that, but I'm looking forward to doing that someday for the exact reasons that you were just sharing about. I hadn't put that into those words though, like you just shared. So I really appreciate you sharing that. And the timelines piece, healing the timelines, I'm like, this is really the big work that we're being called to task here. And there's so many layers in the relationship with the land, even that I experience here. I've lived in this home for 7 years. I love it so deeply. And as soon as I walked onto this land, had this experience of feeling the memories of the land, of how the spirit of the land has for millennia been connected to and in deep reciprocal relationship with the Takelma and Shasta people who have lived here, and how strange and confusing it was for the land consciousness when other people moved here who were basically energetically severed at their feet. It's like they didn't have those roots of reciprocal energetic connection with the land, like the land had been experiencing with human consciousness for eons before that. And of course, there's so much grief in that, both in the human story and the land story with that. And it does feel like you were talking about the different codes that are coming up. What's coming up now is this aspect of healing that we're really being called to come into a space of healing. And because you work in such a way with this, translating different languages or modalities, what other languages or modalities do you work with where you experience these codes of healing coming through them? There's clearly the plants, writing, the land itself, obviously astrology, you're very connected with that. Are there any others that you feel called to speak to right now?
The first one that comes to mind immediately is dancing for me. Dancing is really big in my life. One of the last couple of times that I was in Kiskeya, one of my uncles, who I hadn't seen in some time, and he used to live with us when I was younger. He left to the Dominican Republic. He used to live with us in New York City when I was younger. He left to the Dominican Republic. I think I was probably not even a teenager yet when he left. So that kind of early on, but we saw each other and we were just sitting there, just like enjoying the afternoon. And he's like, "Do you still dance a lot?" And I was like, "Yeah." And then he's like, "Yeah, you used to always dance when you were younger. Like you were the center of the party, or, you know, the center of attention at parties, because my parents used to have like family parties when I was younger. And apparently I used to always dance. I don't have any recollection of these things, but apparently I was always dancing." So I love movement. It feels really important to me when it comes to, again, that translation process. I feel like I'm actually picking up on the pulses, the heartbeat of the earth in a sense when I'm dancing. You know, I don't know. I get really like, I have a whole spiritual experience when I dance. And when I've experienced, so something that I've noticed when my connection to dance is connected to transition processes. So one of those processes being death. I've had the same experience multiple times, but there are these intense moments that I have, for instance, when somebody in my family is dying. Like the last 2 times that it happened to me was when my grandmother on my father's side passed away. So my father's mother passed away. And then when my grandmother on my mother's side when her sister passed away. So my grand or great aunt, but she passed away. And those were the last 2 times I had that experience. For some reason, right around the time when people are about to die, I like do these. There's this tradition in the Dominican Republic, a spiritual tradition called 21 divisions. And 21 divisions is considered Dominican voodoo, but 21 divisions, they have a particular type of music called palo music, which is a ceremonial kind of music. So I'll dance to this music and I go into like these trances, but I feel really like I'm on the land itself when I'm doing that dance. But that's a whole other story. The whole point is both these times when these people in my ancestry and my lineage were transitioning, I would always be dancing to this particular kind of music and go into like a whole trance state. And then within days or the same day, for instance, with my great aunt, my mother's aunt, my grandmother's sister, I found out the next day that she passed away. And then when my grandmother was 2 days later, she passed away 2 days after that. But dancing for me is just like, like I said, I'm channeling a heartbeat, which is really interesting because I feel like I'm channeling a lively heartbeat, but I'm also channeling like the end of a heartbeat, if that makes sense, with that whole process of like, when these people in my family have died, and this has happened to me more than 2 times, but these are the 2 most recent times that I've experienced that. But when these people in my family have passed away, I've always been like doing this ceremonial dance. I just end up doing it around the same time and then they pass away. And it's just like, I go into the thing is that it's so connected to my body because I get these really bad headaches when that happens. And then when I find out that they pass away, the headache is gone. It's the craziest. I don't have any science behind this. I've experienced this multiple times. But dancing is a big one for me. And apparently it's been a thing for me since I was young, even though I don't have, because of the trauma that I experienced, I have a lot of repressed things that I see things in dreams and, they feel like memories, but I don't have like a conscious recollection of things.
Clearly working so much with the power of moving energy with dancing. That's incredible. Do you ever work with dance in that way to move energies with other types of healing? It definitely sounds like you're supporting the crossing over in that process with the dancing. And it feels to me like there's so much energy coming up to the surface to be healed right now on the collective. And it sounds like dance could be an incredibly powerful way to support people, ourselves through that process of clearing things.
Definitely. I mean, I can kind of get a little bit more intimate. I'm not going to go into too much detail, but I did experience a pregnancy loss in 2020, right before everything happened with, the virus. But I experienced a pregnancy loss in March of 2020. And something that I was doing before I even knew that I was, again, this is a pattern. Like, I'm like, wow, this is crazy. Because I'm thinking about it as I'm saying this. But before I found out that I had found out I was pregnant I have a daughter. The day after her birthday, I found out I was pregnant. And when I found out I was pregnant, partner and I talked about it. Everything was good. Days after that, I started bleeding, but I was still testing positive for pregnancy. So I didn't know what was going on, but I was in pain. My body was aching. I assumed I was still pregnant. It was just an ectopic pregnancy, which is a pregnancy that implants itself outside of the uterus. So that's why I was bleeding, because where the implantation had ruptured essentially, and I had started bleeding internally. So long story short, one of the things that was bringing me the most relief during that time of pain, and I didn't know why I was in so much pain, was dancing. I have videos actually of that time of me dancing, like, and just like vigorously, like trying to move whatever this was out of my body. So, because I felt like I needed to move some energy. So dancing was a thing that came up. I've been working as a postpartum death doula, holding space for people who experience pregnancy loss. And one of the things that I recommend to all of my clients is movement and dance, is things having to do with like moving energy out of the body, alongside things like, closing of the bones, womb closure, which is a postpartum procedure after usually a live birth, but it can be done after any kind of pregnancy release, whether it ends in a live birth or not. So those sorts of practices that, particularly in the traditions that I come from, and my great grandmother, I actually learned that she was a birth worker from my grandmother recently. I didn't know that. And I was like, I felt like that was in my lineage, but I didn't know where in my lineage. And then I had this conversation with my great grandmother who came over, and my grandmother who came over, and she was looking at some of the things that I have. Like, so I have these female reproductive system diagrams and things like that. And she was just asking me what is that for? And I started to explain to her, I do birth work and things like that. And then she's like, oh yeah, my mother was a birth worker in Spanish. So I'm like, wow, like I knew it, but I didn't know where it was in my lineage. And I know like my aunts and things like that, they know things when it comes to postpartum care, particularly, and stuff like that. So I learned a lot through them. But yeah, like that's another point where that comes through for me, is in birth and death work, essentially, in general. It's like this transition. I feel oftentimes like I stand at portals and just like help in movement through portals kind of thing, and that, that's where that comes in for me. It's not something that I chose to do consciously. It's more just, I guess, we have these gifts that we kind of got to do something with them. So
yeah, your healing work is so powerful. Thanks so much for sharing that. And I'm so sorry for your loss, and also it's so incredible that you are so connected to these tools of transformational healing. That is so powerful. And yeah, I totally feel your work with the portal work. That is so powerful. How do you feel like the plants really support your work, your life's work in that way?
Well, they nourish me for sure, because this kind of stuff, I feel like because of the way that the internet now, how things are so widespread, like there's a lot of people who are, coming forward and saying that they're mediums or they're psychics or they're intuitives, which is great. People are tuning into their gifts, but I feel like there are some charlatans out there. And on top of that, I feel like oftentimes people don't talk about how taxing this work actually is, energetically speaking. Like I get exhausted, like very exhausted, to the point where I just want to lay down. I don't want to do anything. So plants for me, especially flower essences like Morning Glory lately, has been holding me up very strongly when it comes to just like not burning out, essentially, which I was experiencing a lot of burnout for years, like chronic periods of burnout. I would be fine for like a month, and then 3 months of burnout. Fine a month, 3 months of like, that was such a bad cycle for me. So getting in tune with, I do a lot of work with plants and sharing the plants with others, but like really putting my own medicine to use for my own body and just to sustain my energy as I do this work. And that's something that they offer me a lot. I feel like they offer me wise counsel through dreams. I have dreams when I'm at these crossroads in my life, and the plants are there, and I make my decision based on those dreams. And every time I make decisions based on those dreams, my life is okay. And then when I don't trust those messages, I always have these crazy experiences. So I've learned throughout time that this kind of stuff, as far-fetched as it may feel to some people, it's about, I feel for me, is about tuning into source, tuning into the light codes, the sun, the energy that powers life and things like that. It's really just about being in tune with that life force that's in everything, if that makes sense. So it may feel, and this is why I was telling you, I love science, because I'm very spiritual, but I'm also very aware of how much, people think science and spirit are separate, but there's so much of these things that if we actually had the funding, we could go into doing research on how these phenomenons are the case. And we could probably find some kind of, at the very least some kind of vibrational connection, whether that's through brainwave studies and, that kind of stuff. But I'm sure that there is some science to this, because science really etymologically means to know. And we have these innate knowings. So it's just a matter of finding like the verbiage for these experiences, essentially.
I totally experienced that with science too, that it's just another framework of looking at the same information and experience. That's so cool that you work with it in that way. And clearly your healing work is so powerful. And so tell us, how can people find out more about you and your work? And if you have any projects coming up on the horizon that you'd like to share about?
Well, one of the main things that I'm working on right now is revamping my education center. So I will be launching a site specifically for my education center. Right now I have a site. It has stuff about my education center on there, but it's not just for that. So it's kind of merged. You can find, my potions on there. You can find some of my sound work because I collaborate. I have a friend who I collaborate with in making sound medicine with plants, Alicia Kaya. We recently released a couple singles in the past year, and we're going to be releasing some more stuff this summer that's coming up. So all of that is found on goldwateralchemy.com. And as I mentioned, I'll be launching a separate website, and I'll be announcing the link for that website once it's available. It's available. I'm just not going to announce it yet. But once I launch that in the fall, then people will be able to go on there, and I'll be sharing a lot on there. Some offerings, including the apprenticeship that I've been holding for the past 5 years now. I've had it 4 times in the past 5 years. It'll be like an updated, upgraded, brand new kind of version of that. And then some other of my offerings, which include Free the Womb, which is a womb healing, reproductive justice, knowledge share, and then a couple other offerings I'll have on there. So for now, you can find my stuff on goldwateralchemy.com. I'm also on Instagram at goldwateralchemy, all one word, quote unquote, Gold Water Alchemy. And then I'm also at Instagram at Gold Water Education Center. So I have, once I launch the website, I'll be using the Gold Water Education Center IG for education center stuff. So that's where you can find me for now. And then my email is goldwateralchemy@gmail.com if you want to get in touch and chat or, expound further on anything that I shared here or share your thoughts on anything that I've shared today. I definitely welcome conversation.
Amazing. Well, Elsie, thank you so much for joining us. Just such an honor to have you here. And I love connecting and hearing more about your deep work. It is truly an honor for you to join us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. It's been a pleasure as always.
And thanks so much for listening and joining us today on the Plant Spirit Podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and please follow to subscribe, leave a review, and look forward to seeing you on the next episode.